Thanks everyone for joining us. We're really excited about the amount of registrants for this fourth RIPPT webinar series, or fourth RIPPT webinar in our series. And this one's going to be on the strategies for successful DPT PhD programs. We're going to have all the answers. So what we're going to do is run this format a little bit differently than the other webinars in that it's going to be more of a discussion. So we have 6 panelists here, and we're very grateful that they've given up their time tonight to participate and answer some of the questions. So 3 of them are program directors, and then they've brought with them students from their program, DPT PhD students from their program. So we'll have both of them kind of answer questions as we go through. But at the start, what we'll do is have each program director present a single slide, just a little overview about their program, and so that we can understand a little bit about the nuances and maybe some of the differences between them. So what I'll do now is, first of all, I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Kelly Westlake. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Department of Physical Therapy and Rehabilitation Science. And I'm also the director of the PhD program and the DPT PhD program. Our program is somewhat newer, the DPT PhD program is, that is. So I'm hoping to learn a lot and take some messages away from this meeting as well. So what I'll do now is turn it over to our panelists, and I'm going to have Darcy Reisman go first, and she can introduce herself, and then her student can introduce herself, and then give a little overview about the program. And we'll do that with Eddie next, and then John. So Darcy, I'll have you flip into your slide now.
Okay. Can everyone see the shared screen with UD?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, good. Okay, perfect. So I'm Darcy Reisman. I'm a professor and chairperson of the Physical Therapy Department at the University of Delaware. And I have with me tonight, Kirsten McCartney. And Kirsten, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten McCartney. I just graduated from UD's Physical Therapy Program in January and just finished my first PhD today.
All right. So she's got the fresh-eyed perspective. All right, so just a little bit about our DPT PhD program. It really got started with a T32 grant that's over 20 years now of continuous funding of that grant, which has really been what has enabled us to have this robust program. And what this training program does, or what this program does, is it fuses 2 independent training programs, the doctorate in physical therapy and the interdisciplinary PhD in biomechanics and movement science. And the training grant funds slots for 4 trainees at a time. And the trainee is funded during the last year of the DPT program, and then up to 4 years of PhD training, plus they're funded for research activities. The programs are actually sequential. So this is not a dual degree program. In the sense that they're not taking necessarily, they can take classes for the biomes program, but typically our students apply and are accepted into the biomes program at the end of their 2nd year of their DPT program, and they do this before they leave on their final clinical rotations. And so some students will take a biomes class or so before they leave, but that's in no way required. And during the DPT program, students that are interested in the PhD complete lab rotations. And once on the T32 training grant, the students will have selected a lab and participate in biome seminar, lab meetings, and they're typically working on a small project in that transition time while they're finishing up their DPT and starting their PhD. I should mention that we have been very fortunate over the years as this program has developed, is to have more interest in the DPT to PhD program than we have funding slots on our T32. And so what our department has started to do is we have begun to provide our own funding separate from the T32 grant, because one of our philosophies is that, you know, it's a barrier to students to incur a lot of debt during their DPT, that students who incur a lot of debt during their DPT, it becomes a barrier to making that transition into their PhD when they have a lot of debt. And so one of the things we're really trying to do is, outside of the T32, find ways to fund part of their DPT so that that is not a barrier for them. And so what students are doing is they're applying for funding, and either they are end up being funded off the T32, or they end up being funded off department funds if they're selected. And otherwise, the students kind of follow the same pathway, whether they're on the T32 or not. We have mentors in the PT department, of course, for these students, but also we have mentors in kinesiology and applied physiology, biomedical engineering, mechanical engineering, psychology, and communication sciences and disorders that students can choose to work with. Typically speaking, most of our students, their lab rotations tend to be with PT faculty, and often when we have students that choose a mentor in these other programs, they've typically come in with a kind of a specific interest, and we've steered them towards these faculty in these other departments. So with that, I will stop sharing, and later on I'll be happy to take any questions.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thanks, Darcy. That was great. Nice overview. Okay, Eddie, do you want to start sharing your slides now?
Sure. Can you see that? Okay, well, thanks for inviting us to participate in this session. I'm very happy to hear about the other programs that are doing similar types of attempts at combining into a dual degree program. So I am very pleased to be joined by Mary Alice Saltalo da Silva, who is our very first student in this program and who is just getting ready to graduate. So it's a very exciting time for our program and for her. So this is a program that is actually a collaboration between Emory Physical Therapy, which is in the School of Medicine at Emory University, and the program in Applied Physiology at Georgia Tech in the School of Biological Sciences. And our program began in 2015. We enrolled our very first student, Mary Alice, in 2017. And the way this program works is the intent is that the students are able to save a year of the PhD by dual enrolling in the third year of the DPT. So they apply to the PhD, they must be accepted into the PhD program and complete successfully 2 years of the PT program before they can apply to the PhD program at Georgia Tech. They apply in the fall of their second year, and if they're accepted, then they are notified in the spring of the third year of their DPT and begin classes in the third year of the DPT at Emory and Georgia Tech at the same time. So they take some of the same classes at the same time. So that theoretically cuts out a year of time. In addition to that dual enrollment, they have the opportunity to apply some of the classes that they've taken at Emory to their credits toward the PhD at Georgia Tech. And at this time, the way the program works is that in the first summer after graduation from the DPT program, the students are funded by the PT program in that very first summer. They do some TA work, but also do their lab work, begin doing some lab work. And then in the fall of their first post-DPT time, when they're really a full-time PhD student, they start doing TA shifts at Georgia Tech, and they have the opportunity to have 1 year of GA shifts to cover their stipend and tuition for that first full-time PhD year. And then after that, the expectation is that the mentors will be able to fund the students. I would like to just back up and say that one of the time savings is that students are able to, rather than do a group research project that's required as part of the DPT program, they can do a lab rotation in a lab of their choosing as part of their research requirements for the DPT. So that's another place where they can save time by actually getting started on a project. One of the key points that I advise students about when they first can start considering the program is to identify a mentor early whose work is very interesting and exciting to them, and to make sure that that mentor has the funding to be able to support their stipend and their tuition in the past the second year of the full-time PhD enrollment. And so I'm happy to answer questions once we get into that part. I'm going to stop sharing now so that.
All right, that was great. Okay, John, you want to share yours?
My name is John Buford. I am the director of Ohio State's physical therapy program. I was the original director of the PhD program once upon a time, but I'm not in that role anymore. I am joined by our graduate student, Julia Mazzarella, who actually is working with Jill Heathcock as her PhD advisor. So she and I will be available in the panel to answer questions about what it's like at Ohio State. We started this thing in about 2007. I think we've had something like 8 people gone through the full-blown program. So, you know, 1 a year, maybe some years without one. Much like what Eddie described, the student starts out as a DPT. And at Ohio State, as long as they are enrolled in the PhD portion before they get their diploma with the DPT, they can qualify for Ohio State's definition of a dual degree student. We used to have them apply to both and begin that at the beginning, but so many students got into it and then said, you know, I think I'd really like to just be a PT, that it made the graduation statistics for the PhD program look really bad. And so we decided that we wanted to wait until they'd been here for a year or two and they were really darn sure that this was what they were going to do, and then have them transition into that, like I said, right before they, at least before they get the diploma, but typically sometime in the 3rd year. So it does draw students to our program who think they might want to get a PhD, and I think that's fine, even if they don't all go ahead and do it, because they all do what we call a research specialization, which is available to them as something above and beyond they can do while they're enrolled as a TPT student at Ohio State. And anybody who's going to do the dual degree program does the research specialization program. Some of them decide that's enough, and that's fine. We are able to provide additional scholarship funding for those folks who are in the dual degree program while they're in the DPT phase, to sort of offset what they would have made if they got a part-time job, and make them sort of have the time to really be in the lab and not have to worry about that. Some number of students are successful in competing for university fellowships based on, but that's a campus-wide competition and we have no control over who they choose. But when they come in with an application that says, I want to be a dual degree student and get a DPT and a PhD, they fare better than a DPT student who says, I like little old ladies and I want to be nice to them. So that, you know, that application reads better to the selection committee at the university, and they tend to succeed better than sort of the typical DPT student does in that competition. While they're engaged in the DPT program proper, they can complete lab rotations if they're not sure who they want to work with. They don't have to. If somebody's already done some research as an undergrad with one of our faculty and is absolutely certain who they're going to choose for their mentor, we're not going to force them to do a research rotation. They can go ahead and choose that mentor. What they need to have at the time of sort of formally being accepted into the PhD part is they need to have a mentor who's committed. And there needs to be, we don't just sort of take them and hope we can find a mentor for them. There has to be an identified match with that student and a mentor. And the mentor has to have some kind of funding plan for that student. You know, that may involve an agreement with the school for the student to be a TA for a semester or two, or not. It may be the mentor has the grant funding and wants the student to really concentrate on their PhD work. This sort of the typical PhD phase is about 3 years, maybe 4. So like what Eddie was describing, I think things that shave time off the PhD phase are they get a little bit of credit for classes they've taken, research time in the lab counts as at Ohio State, that's 89.99 is the course number, that sort of generic research credit course. They build up a number of those credits. They can take a course or two if they can squeeze it in, maybe a stats course, maybe an elective in, pediatrics or whatever their area of research is going to be, if that works, if they can do that while they're in the DPT phase. And most students have got maybe one or two of those at most, and a number of those research lab credits accumulated. That all pays off. But I think the main thing that shaves time is that they have been in the lab working with the mentor, and the wheels have been turning, and they're beginning to think like a scientist. And when they walk into their first day of PhD school, they're not really thinking like a first-year PhD student. They're thinking like a second or a third-year PhD student because they've been in the environment. And they tend to be very realistic with their proposals for what they're going to do for their dissertation, because they've been, by the time they're proposing their dissertation, they've been in the lab kind of for 3 or 4 years, and they're not going to choose pie in the sky unrealistic projects. So that also saves some time. Funding is a combination of things you can see in the slide. One of the other things we did is we figured out a way that they could work in the clinic. It was sort of a trick that we managed to arrange through our arrangement with the clinic. You can't be a graduate student at Ohio State and a part-time hourly wage earner at Ohio State at the same time. That's against human resources rules, and we tried to get them to break those rules, and they said the federal government will kill us if we do that. So they weren't going to do that. But there's no rule that says you can't be a graduate associate in more than one program at the same time. You could be a graduate associate in exercise science running the rec center for 25% and a graduate associate in your research lab for 25%. And there's no rule about that. So we created a scenario where they're a graduate associate and their job is be a physical therapist. And the clinic reimburses the program for what they would normally pay a per diem physical therapist, which is more than we would normally pay for 25% effort. And we get special permission from the grad school for an overload. They'll let you go up to 75% instead of 50% if you can promise them that it's not going to impede progress towards the degree and that it's really a useful thing. Well, we can make an argument that being involved in clinical practice for somebody who's going to be a dual degrees person is a useful thing for them to do. In fact, it would be a bad idea if they don't. And so they always have approved this. And that way the student can bump up their income and achieve, maintaining their current clinical practice in a way that doesn't run afoul of human resources situation. So that's my spiel.
Okay, that was great. That was a nice overview. I think a lot of you touched on the same points, but then there were different points between the programs. So what we'll do now is I'm going to start asking questions. We have some questions to go through, but I wanted to also open it up to everyone else to ask questions. So if you have one, I think at this point, the best way is to just add them in the chat and we'll be monitoring them and I can ask them as we go along. So I'll just start with the first question. And I know one of the things that I was interested in among all of your programs is that it seems like everybody's applying at the end of their second year. And John, I think you touched on the point that you tried doing it earlier on, but it just didn't work out. Is that similar for Darcy and Eddie? Did you try earlier or did you always go for that at the end of the second year?
So I had the advantage of having had a prior experience where we tried this and had the same experience that John mentioned, where people initially thought they would be interested in it and, applied with the intention to do both. And more times than not, they changed their minds. And I think by the time they get to their second year of the program, they have a good sense about whether or not they are up for the challenge of a PhD program and have questions that they want to answer, or whether they really want to go into the clinic.
Yeah. Okay. Darcy, you're nodding your head. I think this probably sounds about the same. And that makes complete sense. So the question I also had is, in that application process at the end of the second year, what are some of the things that the primary considerations that kind of feed into your decision to admit an applicant?
I would
Let
say in
Darcy
our
go, because
case,
I think she wanted to
basically,
talk last time.
oh, I'll just say in our case, they've already got, we've almost, I don't think we've ever turned anybody down, because at that point they're into the thing, and we know they're going to do it, and they know they're going to do it, and it's a fait accompli.
Yeah, so for us, as I said, we are really focused on, so people can apply for funding. And so really, what we're looking for, and so their application process is also an application for them to be funded. And, really what we're looking for there is, this is many times the students, when we do our interview days for the DPT program, we have a DPT to PhD interest session. And 99% of the time, those students have attended that session and expressed their interest in that session. And then they're reaching out to us as they enter the DPT program. So similar to John, we've already, by the time they're applying, they have a long history of interest and working with us. And so what we're doing as they're applying for that funding, and we're helping shepherd them through doing lab rotations, et cetera, we're really looking for their commitment. Did they do lab rotations? We asked them to write reflections on the lab rotations that they've done, and what they learned from those lab rotations. And that's really what we're looking for. What is the dedicated interest there, and have they shown initiative in doing the rotations and getting some value out of them? But we really try hard not to turn people down, because we feel like training clinician scientists is so important. And so if someone has showed a dedicated interest in is being successful in the DPT program, we try to find a way to move them along.
So in the Emory Georgia Tech program, the Georgia Tech admissions process goes through the School of Biological Sciences. So the students are competing against all the applicants to the School of Biological Sciences, which includes basic scientists and applied physiologists and our applicants. And we have not had any student that has not been favorably reviewed and not admitted to that by that committee.
And then I just wanted to flip it over to the students right now. So maybe Kirsten, since you're kind of fresh you're probably the most recent into terms of when you applied. So what were some of the decisions that kind of went into your, or what were some of the factors that kind of went into your decision whether or not to apply to the program?
I kind of made the decision to go DPT to PhD before I applied to UD. So I had put in my physical therapy application already. And then through a mentor at my prior job, we kind of talked about that. She's a DPT to PhD. And so was doing research with her, got involved. And then that's when I kind of looked at my list again, and the schools that had dual degree programs or consecutive programs like University of Delaware did. That's just kind of when I did my research on, who was at those universities that was potentially doing research I was interested in. And then I went and made some calls and met different potential mentors. But for me, it was once I had the blend of clinical work and research, which I did at my former job, I was kind of sold on that pathway. And so that's what kind of brought me into that path.
Right. So I'm just going to flip over to some of these questions from the audience because they're good ones. So the first one I think is interesting. And what are people's experience in trying to apply for the NIHT or F awards to support the DPT PhD program?
Well, I'll jump in on that one. I will say that having applied for the T32, it's very clear that those programs that have been long established have a major advantage over new programs. Mm-hmm. You're asked to provide information about the history of your graduates and what kind of funding they have achieved. And so it's very difficult for new programs. We have had success with, for example, Mary Alice received a fellowship from the American Heart Association. And we have a student who is currently in the application process for an F award. And so we have our fingers crossed.
So, and Darcy,
I guess I would just throw in that when I was originally PhD program director, that my boss was like, John, you need to write a training grant. And my answer was, it's a waste of my time because of what Eddie said. I think we're getting to the point now where it wouldn't be silly for us to apply for one of those things, but you do need a track record. And, in your first couple of years, it's a lost cause. We have had, Julia has an F30. Which is very competitive. We've had a few students get those individual fellowship awards. So, with Jill Heathcock as her advisor, she's been very successful. And Stephanie DeStasi has also had a student get an F30. Laura's had students get regular F31. So, and a lot of PODS funding. So we've had a lot of those kind of individual, but at the full-blown training grant, you have to have a track record. I don't think you have to be quite as far along as Delaware is, but you've got to be several years in and demonstrate that you've got people who've gone on to succeed, or you're not going to get it.
Yeah.
One thing I would,
oh, sorry.
Sorry.
If I can,
I was just gonna, go ahead.
No, I was just going to jump in and say that I think one thing that if you're thinking about the structure of a new program like this, the sequential versus concurrent degree award can sometimes qualify or disqualify a student from applying for certain funding awards. So I know when I was in the position of looking around for funding options, actually tried to reach out to some funding organizations to just clarify the language, and was actually, because I already had a doctorate degree, was not then eligible for PhD funding through certain specific awards. So just, again, sometimes there is wiggle room. It's certainly not a make or break everywhere, but just as, just to kind of keep in mind, I think that's useful to know.
Yeah, and just to speak to the F30 award, so it's a really great mechanism that can fund up to 6 years of both DPT and PhD, but it's very extensive application for somebody really early in their research career. I couldn't imagine writing that grant when I was a DPT student, so I don't know how realistic it is as an option to fund the entire DPT PhD program for a student, but it is a great option. I think, once you're in the PhD and have an understanding of the research that you want to do and, what your dissertation project is going to be.
So I think there's also some questions coming through for the students regarding clinical time. And I know, Julia, was that part of your model where you had worked in the clinic to sort of support some of the your DPT PhD? So
yeah, so I still work in OSU. I work at one of the OSU hospitals, and I started that pretty much right after I finished, as soon as I got my PT license. And it's been hugely helpful to gain that clinical experience, so that as I'm kind of entering this field of PT research, I, can say from experience that I kind of, know what I'm talking about. But it's also been really helpful from a financial standpoint too, because like Dr. Buford said, it is a lot more than they would pay me as a TA. And it's in addition. So it's helpful from that perspective as well. And they're very flexible. Most of, from my experience and other students in the program, very flexible with our hours and when we work. So I think it's been a great addition to my learning experience.
And Darcy, I know you have to take off now. Do you have time for one more question, or do you have to leave immediately?
No, it's fine. I'll hop on.
Okay. You'll just hop off when it's time. Okay. I just wanted to ask you a question because you do have the T32. So with the clinical, some of the questions are coming through with the clinical internships and whether or not they kind of take up some of the, is there research time allotted to some of the clinical internships, and how do the students feel about taking that time away if that's the case?
So we do not have any requirement. They are encouraged to do their normal clinical rotations. You know, some of the faculty members encourage them to maybe do them locally, so they can still participate, you know, somewhat in the lab. But we, you know, my philosophy is that this is their time to do their clinical rotations, and they're going to have lots and lots of time to do research and learn research, and so they should go and do those clinical rotations. So we really encourage them to do that. And Kirsten, for example, she had started a small project with me, and while she was on her clinical rotation, she was able to work on the small project. We would have Zoom calls and things. So I think, you know, I think that they can take advantage of both opportunities.
That's great. And they didn't have to, so the students who are, I think you have 4 slots for the T32, and then you said there's more students who are now applying. Do you think that that might be a model that you would, you know, just to consider funding? I know some, if they want to work with somebody who doesn't necessarily have their own grant funding, would that be an option to them to work clinically?
So we have our clinic at the University of Delaware, and we encourage all of our PhD students, whether they're DPT to PhD or whether they're, you know, coming back, we really encourage them to work in our clinic. We will train them as CIs if they're interested in doing that. And, you know, Kirsten and I have had a lot of conversations about, you know, she's working in the clinic now, and, you know, how much time, because, you know, she really wants to hone those clinical skills, right? And so, as Julia was saying, I think it's a balance, you know, how much time. As John was saying, there must be some rule, because we have the same thing, John, it has to be less than 10 hours a week. So there's probably some federal guideline, but yeah, we really encourage them to work in the clinic and hone those skills while they're getting their PhD. And I think it helps them with clinical questions.
Right. Okay, great. And I see, so thank you panelists for answering some of these questions in the chat as they come through. I think people will appreciate them because we're not going to get to everything. So how about the, I think, sorry, I had the question here, now I've lost it. Have students considered a mid-DPT gap for their PhD training? So for example, 2 years of DPT and then PhD, then clinical rotation. So similar to what would happen in an MD PhD.
Can I take this before I have to hop off?
Yep.
We have tried this and it did not go very smoothly. The students were fantastic. They were great. It's just, you know, the DPT program is kind of a lockstep curriculum, and it's just really challenging. We found to break that up. We did that with 2 students. They've gone on to be very successful, but it was just really a challenge, you know, for our DPT program, and kind of keeping those students on track. And so that's just was our, you know, N of 2 students. It was tough with the way DPT curriculums are set up.
Mm-hmm. I could see that. But we've struggled with that as well. Did anybody else have, Eddie, I think you were going to mention something?
That really would not be an option in the way our dual degree program is set up, because it's between 2 institutions. So it really is necessary for the student to finish the DPT. Well, they do the DPT concurrently with the PhD during the last year, but they have to finish up the DPT. They wouldn't be able to go back and forth because it's between 2 different institutions.
Yeah, I would say we want them to get their DPT so that 2 things. One, they can, like Julia's doing, you know, if they want to get some clinical experience, because, you know, they really need to become a decent clinician if they're going to teach future PT students. And then, but more importantly, we want them to have their license so that if they're doing clinically related research, they're an actual licensed physical therapist, and they can do clinically related research with patients as a physical therapist for their PhD. So we don't want to delay that.
And on kind of the same note, they are physical therapists. So are some of them involved in teaching in the DPT program, so that they can kind of, if they're moving into the DPT PhD, ultimately they probably want to do some teaching as a faculty member. So do they get that experience in the program? Do you encourage that, or?
So in our program, yes, in the first summer after their DPT, the students work as TAs at Emory in the DPT program. And then in their first year of full-time PhD work, after they've graduated from the DPT, they work as TAs in the Georgia Tech program.
Yeah, we have a residency and fellowship programs here, and we have a lab full of residents and fellows teaching our skills labs, to the point where we can't let them all in on any given day. So we actually have the PhD students not do a lot of clinical skills labs teaching, and probably as the PhD researcher type person on the faculty, when they grow up, they're not going to do a lot of clinical skills lab teaching anyway. So that sort of makes sense. We want them we have them practice doing some lecture-based teaching, develop a module of some sort in their area of expertise to get a chance to see what it's like to function at that level. But we don't make them do very much teaching.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I'm just going to flip to a question that I think would be great for programs that are just getting, or thinking about getting started or having difficulty in recruiting. And that's, is there anything specific that you do to introduce the interested DPT students to the DPT PhD program, to kind of get them excited and interested and even pursuing the degree in the first place?
So I meet with the students in the first year of the DPT program, whether or not they've expressed any interest in the program. I will say that I'm often contacted by applicants to the DPT program who believe that saying that they're interested in the PhD program will be an advantage for their application for the DPT. And then I never hear from them again. And surprisingly enough, Mary Alice is an exception, but of those students we've had in the program, they were not the students who met with me in the first year and said, I'm interested in the PhD. All of the people who are currently in the program were people who applied and I didn't even know they were interested. So sometimes they surprise you.
At some point I'll mention something, one thing I remember a professor saying this to me once in college. And so it made if you're the kind of person who's sitting here thinking of a million questions for everything I say, and you're finding that this isn't really taxing your brain to be in PT school, and you have curiosity beyond what we're teaching you, you should think about getting a PhD. And I just let it at that. And I had a student who ended up working with Rachel Biken, who's getting ready to finish now, come up to me and say, that's me. I think I want to do that PhD thing. So you never know who's listening. And she's done really well. So, we throw it out there. Sometimes they don't know it until somebody suggests it to them. Mm-hmm. And, we talk about it here and there, but I think it's more the one-on-one contact, especially when our research specialization program, when they actually are working with the faculty, they're like, this is really cool. And some of them want to keep doing it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of going to ask a similar question to the students now. So when you were applying to PT school, was the DPT PhD program on your mind? And is that kind of what led to your decision to apply to that particular PT school?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think absolutely. So I think I was a little bit of an outlier. I had been told by a friend who was already a PT who knew that I was also interested in research sort of peripherally, that I should go to a conference. And so I ended up, like 2 weeks later, there was the APTA Next conference was happening. And so I jumped on a plane and went down there. And it was truly because I walked into one of the first sessions, the Frontiers in Rehabilitation Science and Technology info sessions, or, like platforms, that I learned about Emory's program. I heard Dr. Wolf speak, and that's what put it on my radar. And all of a sudden was like, the whole thing sort of unraveled very quickly, because like within like 2 weeks, Emory had / Georgia Tech had become my first choice school, and sort of like, you know, it all happened to work out. So yes, I think definitely, because I was like fresh I came through a post-bac program. I had a first career before coming back to school. And so because the sciences were very fresh in my mind, I knew that and was seeking that out very specifically.
I also intended on doing the dual degree before I even applied for PT schools. I was actually doing research in a different field prior and was very interested in continuing to do research, but I was also wanted to be a physical therapist. And so I mostly sought out programs that offered the dual degree, with the exception of a couple that had kind of been at the top of my list before I made that kind of switch in my interests. But yeah, I 100% chose OSU because of the dual degree program, and because I met Dr. Heathcock, who is my mentor now, and she was very supportive of the type of research that I am interested in. And so it was just a really good fit. But yeah, I definitely came in with that already kind of set in my mind.
I just echo all that. I was totally driven by the PhD side of it as well.
Hmm. So so all three of you knew about it before, and you kind of, it fed into your decision. Okay. But I think that's really interesting. I have the sense that there is sort of a mixed bag, that some people don't really know when they come into the program, and then they find out about research. I think, John, you were mentioning just in our discussion earlier about a way that you, I think your program has in your slide also, you mentioned the research, the DPT research course.
Specialization program, yeah. So they have an option, all of our students, about 25% of our students do this every year, is a research specialization where it's almost like a mini master's degree alongside their DPT at what the level of engagement and what they accomplish. And so that's the normal pathway towards the dual degree anyway, and X number of them convert into the PhD program. One of the things that Jill did, when we were first starting the program, it's not so necessary now because the school's whole PhD program is big enough that it provides this already. But when we first started, really the PT was the only people who were bringing in any PhD students in the school, and we only had a few of them. And what Jill put together is sort of a lunch and learn series that gave students a chance to just socialize with each other while they're in the DPT phase about what does it mean to be a DPT PhD student, and what is this thing called a grant, and what do you mean I should do a postdoc? Why would anyone do that? So we had a chance to sort of talk to them, and Jill put together a nice program with that. At this point, the school's PhD program is big enough that gets done automatically, but we had to do that ourselves within the PT program at the beginning.
So there's a question about whether the graduate students are getting the DPT PhD loans reduced through NIH loan repayment program. Has anyone had experience with that, students or directors?
I have faculty who have done that. I don't know if our graduates have succeeded yet.
I reviewed them,
Definitely
but I've not had a student who actually went through it.
I've definitely talked to recent grads who have had success, but I can't apply for it yet.
I will say it's amazingly competitive. I review those grants as an NIH reviewer, and I'm always amazed at what students accomplish.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a question about the transition between I guess this is more directed toward the students. So how do you deal with the major transition between going from your clinical internships to all of a sudden fully immersed in the research world in your PhD? Do you find that difficult or challenging, and what strategies do you use to overcome it?
My strategy was a 4-week road trip out west. No, I mean, I'd say that as a joke, but that was kind of important. So, I mean, Darcy was great in what she said earlier of when I was out on my clinical, I was able to do some research work, but that was a lot of low pressure. So I was kind of the primary driver of how much I wanted to do on a research side when I was in the clinical rotation. And then I did take a break, and we had discussed that prior, just to kind of take a breath after the PT program before kind of diving into the PhD. I would say because it's happening at the same place, there was definitely a shift and a mental shift and a class coursework type shift and way of thinking. But, you know, a lot was beneficial being in the dual degree. Like, I already had a relationship with my mentor. I knew the other people in my lab. I understood the basics of the research that was going on there. So somewhat of some of those maybe first year curves that I think could happen if I, you know, had finished my DPT at University of Delaware and gone somewhere else for the PhD, I think those would have led to a lot of different types of, you know, getting reacclimated. So it's certainly been a shift in the way I think, and that's been more difficult. But I think being in the environment already and knowing, you know, people here at UD was really helpful in kind of that transition.
Okay, great. I think that I love the road trip idea. That's great. So I guess the other, it's kind of along the same time management and how flipping from one thing to the other. From the program perspective, does Eddie and John, do you have it worked into your program that you will allow time specifically for research for people who in the DPT PhD program?
Eddie?
Not specifically. Personally, I discourage students from trying to do part-time PT work, and they're expected to be in the lab for it 40 hours a week. And we all know, you know, from the PhD experiences that we had, that 40 hours a week probably isn't going to cut it. They're, if they want to do it like on the weekends and that kind of thing, and that's how they want to spend their time on the weekends, then that's perfectly fine. But the expectation is that the PhD program is a full-time program.
Right.
I get that question a lot from students who are considering applying, and I really emphasize that. I personally don't think it's advisable to do part-time PhD program, especially in one that is neurointensive. Yeah.
That's actually a different question that I was hoping to ask as well. So I'm glad you answered it. The other question I was asking you, maybe I didn't phrase this right, but if in the DPT portion, because I know like our program is very jam-packed. So I find it students who are entering into the DPT PhD portion find it challenging to find the extra time to do the lab rotation and to get in the lab to do research at all, even if they wanted to. So I'm just wondering if there's set aside time in your programs for those students who might be interested in moving into that, the DPT PhD phase.
Yeah, we have, like I have described, a research specialization. So, you know, in their spare time while they're a DPT student, they're hanging around in the lab, getting started at that kind of thing. We have we have a practicum. At the last 6 weeks of our DPT program is a leadership practicum experience. That's not necessarily a standard clinical. We've had people go to APTA and do legislative work for that. You know, they can kind of do whatever they want. The PhD, the dual degree student is free to go to the lab and just crank out research for those 6 weeks if they want to. None of them have wanted to. They've all wanted to have some enriching experience that's available to them for that, but they could do that at that stage of the game. But mostly what they've done is they've sort of been hanging around in the lab as a DPT student and doing it in that way.
Okay. And Eddie, do you have any time set aside specifically for research during the DPT stage?
Well, I know it's a somewhat controversial topic, but Emory is of the mind that having students do a research project with a faculty collaborator and faculty advisor is a good experience for all the DPT students. Like, whether or not you agree with that from the DPT student perspective, it is an opportunity for those students who go on to the PhD component to spend that time in the laboratory. And some of them have done it very successfully.
So I'm curious from the students, how much time did you get in the lab?
Yep,
you
that
know,
was my next question.
while you're in the DPT?
Yeah. And how did you manage your time to be able to do that?
Well, I came in kind of knowing I really wanted to work with Darcy, but we discussed me doing lab rotation. So I actually rotated in her lab and then 3 other labs. And so it was kind of like the rough time of a semester is when I would kind of rotate from one lab to another. And then it was just a matter of anyone who I rotated with is a faculty member on the PT side of things. So they have more of an understanding of what the load is for me as a PT student at that time. And Darcy was overseeing at the time any student who was interested in kind of pursuing this consecutive program. And so, I mean, the difference of the amount of time that I was able to put in one winter when it was a little bit lighter on the load was vastly different to what I was able to do in my second summer, which was, maybe 4 to 6 hours a week. But then in the winter, I mean, I was putting in a lot of hours on that, but I was able to kind of dive in with a good project with someone else. And then the whole last spring was when I was in Darcy's lab because we had made the official decision that that's still where I wanted to pursue my time. And so that's when I started a small project based off one of the larger studies that she's working on. And that's what really helped me get integrated into her lab a little bit more and dive deeper into some aspects there. And that's what I kind of continued on starting in June through December when I was out on my clinical rotations. So it definitely is student by student. There's a couple students in the year behind me, and there was one who is in the same program in the year above me in the PT program. And everybody does do it a little bit different just because everyone's interests are a little bit different. And some students will start the rotations of the labs and find a lab they love, and then they are not forced to do any more rotations. So it really does just kind of depend on the students. And then, I mean, I think the time management piece is probably a factor that anyone who's on this path has a little bit of. And so it's just about managing that time and figuring it out.
Yeah. So for me, again, because of the way that Emory's DPT program is structured, I did not feel like I had time to really get into a lab and get that experience prior to going out on my clinical rotations, but I did go in as a subject first for some experiments that were happening as just a way to like get to know the lab and figure out, kind of like what the research looked like, et cetera. So that option is always available to you. But then in my last 2 semesters of the DPT, I fell into that category of like, I started with one lab rotation and it worked quite well. And so I stayed, but was spending, I don't know, 6 to 10 hours a week easily in the lab dedicated to that time as I was finishing DPT coursework and then also taking courses at Georgia Tech. So, and it sounds like a lot. It worked out. It felt very manageable to keep all of those balls in the air.
Just put your head down and get it done.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like my experience was similar to Kirsten's. I started right away when I came into the DPT program, and I had really already identified Jill Heathcock as my mentor. And so I started in her lab like the same week that I started PT school, and kind of just started out with like doing, data analysis and projects that, I didn't necessarily have to be in the lab at, specific days and specific times. So it was a little bit more flexible, and my hours kind of ebbed and flowed with what was going on in the DPT program so that I could prioritize my classes first. But I was pretty much always in the lab except for when I was out on clinical rotations that were like outside of Columbus.
So I think that we're almost down to the last 5 minutes. I feel like we could keep going on with this discussion for a long time, but I want to make sure that we do hit on some kind of bigger picture questions. So I guess I'll ask Eddie and John first. What would be the 2 primary reasons why you think your program is a success, and have there been any big changes that you've really made over the years to ensure that success?
Eddie, go ahead.
So I would say our fantastic faculty. We have some really outstanding mentors, both on the DPT side and on the Georgia Tech side. And no one on the Georgia Tech side is a physical therapist, but they're all people who are interested in the application of applied physiology to humans. And so I think that that's probably the biggest advantage. Plus, we've had great applicants like Mary Alice.
I think the, you know, as I would echo the idea about how you got to have great faculty, you shouldn't try and do this. I think the good thing about it is that it attracts students to your program who are interested in research. They may not all finish this part of the program, but it gets their attention. And I think it helps you attract curious people who are going to make excellent clinicians because they're curious, even if they decide not to get a PhD, and just sort of a culture of let's figure out how to do this better becomes normal. The big change I think we made was to admit them a year or two into the DPT rather than at the get-go. You know, and that has certain drawbacks. Once they're already a student, they can't apply for a university fellowship because they've already been admitted. So, you know, we were able to put together, I think, a clearer case for a university fellowship when they were coming straight in with that intent. Some things like that, you know, are maybe a little bit of a drawback for waiting. But all in all, I think that was something that we had to do.
And just so I'm going to direct towards the students now. So knowing what you know now, what do you think would be most valuable about getting the DPT PhD combined degree? And then what are your next step career directions, I guess? Whether it's kind of faculty or postdoc.
Yeah, so I can jump in. I think I will say one thing I really appreciated about the program is being embedded within a school where they're like the biomedical engineering, bioengineering, and actually the PhD in neuroscience programs were all like, I was sort of enmeshed in those cohorts as well. I shared a lot of coursework with those students. And that really was beneficial in like in widening my lens to you know, the potential for innovation in our field. And frankly, was great to be a clinical, the clinical expert in some of those student collaboration groups. I think I got a lot out of that and really enjoyed those experiences. I think the PhD in particular has helped me not only zoom in and get good at dealing with very complex data on a specific or small scale, but also thinking about, okay, what is the impact of this for our patients? Like in a bigger or wider sense, how does this at the end of the day help someone recover more quickly or to a larger degree than they otherwise would? How does this help them with their, you know, ADL management or whatever the questions are, right? That you're looking to focus in on your research, and that the combination of those two degrees, like I could not have gotten the PhD alone or the DPT alone and come away with that perspective. So I think that's been maybe the thing I value most about it. I have been, to your sort of second question, I have been, at least pre-COVID, COVID, you know, threw a wrench in a lot of plans for a lot of people. But one of the things that was a big part, was always important to me and was a big part of my work was the implementation side of things, is actually like driving research into the clinic and being the person that stands between, you know, the bench and the bedside. So in terms of next steps, exactly what that looks like, I'm not sure yet. I feel like at some point I'll figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. But that's being able to be exposed to that and actually drive some of that work and see the fruits of that in the clinic has been the most exciting part of this for me. And so I think continuing along that path is what sort of drives me in next step decision making.
All right, real quick, do you want, I think Julia, do you want to say something?
Sure, yeah. You know, I kind of echo too that the combined degree experience is really valuable. And, you know, I think moving beyond the DPT, like into the PhD, I've really been able to kind of switch gears into that, like, you know, and as I'm working in the clinic alongside, honestly, has been extremely helpful for this, because I see, you know, I know the research, and then I'm in the clinic and I see how it does and doesn't actually work in clinical practice. That, you know, kind of what you're saying, Mary Alice, like that implementation and translation of knowledge is really key, because I know, you know, and I feel as a clinician too, how hard it can be sometimes to do the things that I know are going to be the best for patient outcomes. So that is really motivating, and being able to be in a position to try and improve that is really exciting. In terms of next steps, I think I go back and forth a lot. I have always kind of thought, and I think, you know, as Dr. Buford said, definitely been encouraged that, you know, postdoc is the way to go. The PhD student in my lab, who is a year ahead of me and about to defend her dissertation, actually just got a tenure track faculty position at Ohio University. And I was kind of like, oh, I didn't know that was something that, you know, I was qualified for. So I've kind of been considering both. And I think somebody mentioned this in the chat, you know, whatever opportunities come up. I actually just finished interviewing for a faculty position. So, you know, we'll see if that comes through or not. I also have an application in for a postdoc. So it's kind of up in the air at this point.
That's great. Whatever opportunities come along.
Yeah.
But the good thing is there's lots of options. So I think that's nice. You guys summed it up well, the advantages of doing the dual degree, and how, you know, I think there are some things that you need to have that combined thought process almost. You're learning both as you come up in your education. So I think that's great.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I totally echo Mary Alice. I feel like I was nodding along with everything that you were saying. And something I think about with the PhD in addition to the DPT is it really opens a lot of doors. And for me, I feel as if not only does it open doors for myself, but it's opening doors for the field. So like we do have to be thinking about what is the impact on the patient, and you can do that so many different ways. Are you educating the next, you know, generation of PT students? Are you advocating for, you know, changes in the healthcare system that's going to give patients the care that we know that is going to actually get them the results that we see from the research, that maybe the blockers insurance? There's so many different ways, I think, to combine. And as technology continues to evolve, the PhD really gives you the chance to interact with, you know, biomechanists or, you know, biomedical engineers who are maybe developing that type of work. And then you can combine and bring it in and say like, hey, this is never going to actually go off in a clinic. Like they don't have the time, they don't have the space to do this, or, oh my gosh, like how could I apply this to this population that I work with? Let's take this and roll. So I'd always think about the ways that we can open up the doors, and really that's just opening up the doors for physical movement to be, you know, kind of liberating for all patient populations.
That's great. Can we just summarize what you three said and put it in a little video so we can show all interested DPT PhD students? I think that you've really summed up some nice advantages. So, okay, well, I think we're a little bit past time, so I don't want to keep everybody here any longer. I first want to really express a lot of thanks to our panelists. I think the discussion has been great, and obviously you've been keeping up with the chat, which I appreciate. And of course, we didn't get to everything. So hopefully you had the majority of your questions answered. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which is on June 22nd, 7:30 to 8:30. So mark the date. It's going to be on systematic reviews and meta-analysis, run by Sujay Sapphire Galen at Georgia State University with Kimberly Morielli and Gordon Warren. So we'll look forward to that on June 22nd at 7:30 p.m. So we'll see you back here then. Thanks, everyone.